For the second lecture, Friday, continue on with coral reef ecosystems. So we looked at all these different aspects of coral reef ecosystems, and we'll look at how reefs are formed, different types of reefs, basically the history of a coral reef that you might find out there. There's a couple of different kinds. There's reefs that are along the edge of continents, very common. There's reefs off of the coast of Florida and all the different continents, especially in the tropics. Some of the reefs that are really interesting, widespread, at least, especially in the Pacific, but some in the Atlantic as well, are oceanic reefs that surround islands, not along the continents. And these islands have a geological history. Typical island. It appears and these islands sink over time. And so if you visit an island and you see the type of reef that surrounds that island, it's indicative of how old that island is. So we'll look at that. We'll look at the fringing reefs, barrier reefs, and atolls. So to begin with, you've got this island that shows up. Volcanic activity, this island comes up and then all this lava forms an island above the water. Now, these little coral polyps, they're larval form, they're floating around. Coral is reproducing, looking for a place to settle. Now, there's new habitat that's available with this new island, and so you have coral that show up there. They can last in the water column as plankton for a while anyway. And these coral larvae show up, they settle, and they start forming this reef. They start growing. And so the first type of reef that you have around an island is a fringing reef. Close to shore, shallow water, where all this primary production is taking place. And that's basically what you have. Right along the edge of the shore, you've got a fringing reef. So there's a lot of islands that are relatively young that have fringing reefs like that. Well, as time goes on, the geological history of islands is that they're eroded. They get shorter and shorter in terms of elevation of the mountains, and they sink. So these reefs basically have to grow in order to keep up with islands sinking. If you're a reef coral and you don't do anything, if the island sinks, then obviously you're going to be in deep water and you're going to be in deep trouble because you're not going to have enough light for your zooxanthellae to photosynthesize. So that's the race that coral are in. Corals don't grow that quickly. Islands don't sink that quickly. It's not a really fast race. But coral have to grow in order to maintain a location in the water column where they're shallow enough to continue photosynthesis in their dinoflagellates. So that's what you see. And as time goes on, this island erodes, like I said, and sediments come down and it's turbid and it's not the best place to grow. The best place for coral to grow is out along the edge. So pretty soon you have a barrier reef. And in between the coral and the island, you've got a lagoon. And so there's a lot of islands like this. If you're on the island, there's this lagoon and there's waves breaking there far offshore. The coral is pretty far away from shore. It's not right along the edge of the shore. Along the edge of the shore, you've got sandy beaches and you've got some coral rubble. But the best place to be, if you're a coral, as long as it's not too deep, is out at the periphery. You've just got to grow and have skeleton building up fast enough to keep you up in the shallow water. So you find these barrier reefs with a lagoon between the reef and the island. Pretty common, this lagoon. And eventually, this island continues to erode, continues to sink. The coral continues to grow around the periphery, and pretty soon all you have left is what used to be a barrier reef, but now there's no island in the middle, and so you have this ring of coral sometimes very symmetrical ring that was the derivation of this ring was around the edge of the island. The island's gone. The island's eroded. The island's sunk. But in the middle, you've got this big lagoon, and around you've got this little islets and sandy places, usually not very high elevation. All that's left, you have sand that's built on top of the coral. It's not the remainder of the island, but the little islets that build up around the periphery of this lagoon, and you've got an atoll. Now, these atolls are very productive. A lot of fish there, a lot of different types of corals. May not be so nice with a big island in the middle with a volcano or high mountains or anything, but still, some of these atolls are the most beautiful places in the world. So let's look at some of those. Here's an atoll in the Cook Islands, owned by New Zealand. Look at that. Wouldn't you like to be there? Look at this island in Palau. This atoll, not very symmetrical in shape. There's one in Tahiti. French Polynesia by Tahiti. Herman Melville spent a lot of time with these. Look at this. We can't travel now very safely, but this, wouldn't you like to go there and be there quarantined instead of some other places? Here's Midway. New movie just came out about Midway, where this big battle during World War II. Not a whole lot. Here's French Frigate Shoals, which looks like half of an atoll because the half in the left corner has sunk down. Here's the Atoll de Sakis. This is in the Atlantic. All those other islands, atolls that I was showing you, are in the Pacific, where they're really common. There's thousands of atolls. In the Atlantic, not so many. And there's a question whether this is a true atoll, because there's a lot of coral and algae and not as much coral that's formed this. All right. Another thing to look at is reproduction in coral. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this, but coral can reproduce two different ways. The asexual reproduction. There's a lot of coral is damaged. It gets broken off by something, wave action. They can bud. They can form buds and reproduce asexually. Or in terms of sexual reproduction, they spawn. And most of these they've got male reproductive organs and female reproductive organs. And so they produce sperm and they produce eggs, two different types of gametes. Those go into the water, and then the eggs are fertilized by the sperm. You've got a bunch of different individuals that are producing eggs and a bunch of different individuals that are producing sperm. So you've got gametes of different individuals that are being fertilized by other individuals, and it's highly synchronized at a certain time of the year, right after a full moon a lot of times, and at night. But it's a big, major event on the coral reef. And so here's the life cycle. They could bud and reproduce that way. But this spawning, where they're releasing gametes into the water column, gametes are fertilized. They have this planktonic larva, this plannula larva that's floating around. They settle and develop into a polyp, and then they deposit this calcium carbonate in their skeleton, and they grow. So, and then they reproduce, and around it goes, reproduction-wise.